The games with the Raiders were not games. No, games are fun, These were wars.
This gentleman has been working for 7 years over in Candlestick Park, and that's only 7 miles of water away from that house of horrors, the Oakland Coliseum.
We had guys that hated them. Would openly say, I hate the Raiders. And then if you talk to the Raiders football team, we hate the Kansas City Chiefs. It's only a game, right? Not this one. This is not only a game. This is Raider Week.
Rivalries, no matter what sport, are built on big games. If you don't play big games that matter to each team, it's not going to be a rivalry. Chicago and Green Bay, that's geography. That's why they can't stand each other. The Chiefs and Raiders didn't have geography, but they had those games in the 60s that created this feeling.
The great storied rivalries in the NFL are rivalries as much for fans as they are for the players. With this, there is genuine animosity, there's genuine ill will, and that's one of the things that makes football great, is in the face of all that, your team prevails.
Kansas City and Oakland, it seemed like it was always a big game. It was always the NBC game late on Sunday afternoons.
And this is the NFL Game of the Week.
That all of America was saying, we got to watch this because it's really fun. They played competitive, important games that meant something.
Even before the Chiefs were the Chiefs, the rivalry began when they were the Dallas Texans. So the rivalry goes way back.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, you bet that rivalry started way back when. How you doing, everybody? My name is Tim Hanlon, and yes, you have stumbled into the wild and wacky world of Good Seats Still Available. What is it? Well, it's our journey each and every week into what used to be in professional sports. I thank you from the bottom of my heart and the heart of my bottom, or whatever that is, for finding us this week. We know you've got a gazillion choices out there in podcast land, and we're just honored that you would give us a little bit of your time and download or stream or wherever you're getting it into your earbuds and giving us a listen. We appreciate it. We have a pretty interesting little topic for you this week, and we can't wait to get into it. Our guest this week is a guy named Matt Erhlich. He's a professor emeritus of journalism at the University of Illinois, and he has a new book out that is a really, I think, a fun and interesting little twist on a little bit of what you just heard in that clip just a few moments ago. The book is called Kansas City versus Oakland, the bitter sports rivalry that defined an era. And as we get into this sort of conversation of a tale of two cities, shall we say, perhaps not the most obvious cities you would choose on the American map to be sort of denoted as rivals in any way, shape, or form, certainly not geographically. This is Kansas City, obviously in the heart of the Midwest, and Oakland, a scrappy and working class city, sort of in the shadows of its sort of richer, or at least historically so, city across the bay in San Francisco. What do these two cities either have in common, or what do they have against each other? Well, certainly sports is at the root of a lot of it, and certainly one of the bitterest rivalries in pro sports emanated from the old AFL of the 1960s between the Kansas City Chiefs, yes, previously domiciled as the Dallas Texans in the earliest days, which we talked about, by the way, with one of those voices that you just heard, Michael McCambridge, in our episode number 3. You might want to dial that one up and listen to that if you've not enjoyed that one already, because there's a fascinating story about how the Texans even got to Kansas City. And thank God they changed their name, because they were, if Lamar Hunt had his name, his way, they would have actually been called the Kansas City Texans. But I digress. But the Kansas City Chiefs, of course, and the Oakland Raiders, soon to be the Las Vegas Raiders, relatively soon. They were the fiercest rivals in the American Football League. And that rivalry certainly carried over into the NFL. And it really kind of helped sort of shape a very interesting narrative about how these two cities, through the eyes and the ears and the play, I guess, of their sports teams, these two football franchises that, for whatever reason, didn't like each other. And pretty early on, they were obviously very good. They were probably the two, if not the two, consistently best teams in the AFL. Certainly that spilled over in those transitory years between, those early Super Bowls when the AFL and the NFL theoretically coexisted. And obviously, the rivalry has kind of waned and waxed over the years. But as you heard in that clip, and Len Dawson, one of the voices there, he encapsulated it. They call it Raider Week, right? It's not just a game. It's an entire week of preparation and a reminder of all the kinds of ill will and bad blood, and frankly, just amazing competitive games that have happened over the years. And if you really want a treat, go back into YouTube and some of these old NFL films things and check out some of these amazing games, especially AFL championship games when things are really on the line. These two teams not only did not like each other, but they played the hell out of each other year in and year out. Obviously, we mentioned Lamar Hunt. He's a voice in that clip that you just heard. A guy named Bob Gretz, who's the author of Hail to the Chiefs. He kind of sets the tone a little bit. And of course, you heard Michael McCambridge. And of course, Peter King of Sports Illustrated, longtime pro football writer. All of those gentlemen in that clip kind of sort of underline that sort of rivalry, that very bitter rivalry that the Chiefs and the Raiders sort of brought to bear. And it becomes kind of a backdrop on this sort of broader theme about these two cities and how that sports rivalry, and frankly, another one, a little less obvious, but there's also a baseball component to this. And we're going to get into that too with Matt Erhlich in a few moments. And it's not necessarily a directly competitive one, although the Royals and the A's over the years, the Oakland A's, of course, and the Kansas City Royals, of course, have had their moments. There's no doubt. But for those of you who are of a certain age, you may actually not remember the fact that the A's were in Kansas City for a bunch of years before they moved to Oakland. They were the Kansas City A's. They moved from Philadelphia in the late 1950s, early 1960s. I'm sorry, the date escapes me at the moment. But a guy by the name of Charles Finley, if you remember that name, I'm sure most people do, baseball authoritarians will remember, the purchaser of said franchise, and then bolted from Kansas City to Oakland. And that is an amazing story in and of itself. But the interesting intrigue between the Kansas City A's bolting for Oakland, the replacement very shortly thereafter of a brand new franchise in the American League called the Royals, a new stadium, which is obviously still today known as Kauffman Stadium. All of that is also very much part of this not only rivalry, but sort of friction between these two cities that, again, if you open up the map, you would not have guessed in a million years that Kansas City, Missouri, and Oakland, California would be such interesting, at least on the sporting landscape, rivals. And we get into that very interesting topic, again, with our guest, Matt Erhlich, coming up in just a few moments. This is a really intriguing discussion. And not only by reading the book will you be entertained by it, but hopefully in our conversation coming up in just a couple of moments. And we urge you to stick around because of some really interesting stories and things that I didn't even know about around baseball and football and these two cities. And I think you're going to really enjoy it. And I really do think you'll also enjoy one of our sponsors this week, and that's Audible. Of course, our friends at Audible who offer you a free month of the Audible service and a free audiobook download when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats and sign up. You can cancel at any time. It's basically a no-risk obligation. And the book that you download, even if you cancel the service, is yours to keep as long as you keep your device. And it's really cool because there's some really interesting audiobooks that you could get that very much fit the theme of this week's episode. For example, you fancy yourself as a Kansas City Chiefs fan? Well, how about listening to the Rick Tellender book, he of Sports Illustrated fame and other sports writings, called Like a Rose, Life Lessons from a Training Camp with Hank Stram and the Kansas City Chiefs. It's a fascinating read, and it's a great sort of little history about the Kansas City Chiefs, sort of as seen through the eyes of one of their legendary coaches, Hank Stram. Okay, maybe you're not a Chiefs fan. Perhaps you're an Oakland Raiders fan. Well, okay, there's an audiobook that you can download and use your credit for there too. It's called Badasses, The Legend of Snake, Foo, Dr. Death, and John Madden's Oakland Raiders. It's written by Peter Richmond, and it's narrated by Barry Adams. You can listen to all 12-plus hours of that book with your free credit. Why don't you? At audibletrial.com/goodseats. And maybe you're just not a football fan at all, but you really want to understand this sort of dynamic between the A's, the Kansas City version that moved from Philadelphia, and then the Oakland version once they moved from Kansas City. Well, the person in the midst of all of that and responsible for all of that is, of course, Charlie Finley. And his cousin's daughter, who was part of the mix when they moved to Oakland as part of the front office, Nancy Finley, has written a fascinating book, and you can listen to it in audio form, narrated by Pam Ward. It's called Finley Ball, How Two Outsiders Turned the Oakland A's into a Dynasty and Changed the Game Forever. So there you go. You've got no excuse not to go to audibletrial.com/goodseats to get your free 1-month subscription to the Audible service, and including, of course, one free audiobook download for you to keep, to listen to enjoy. And again, you can cancel at any time. You don't have to pay for that book, and you can keep it as long as your device exists. Why not? After listening to this episode, sign up at audibletrial.com/goodseats. Get a free audiobook and one of those that I just suggested. It's a great way to complete your education, kids. And you'll be glad you did, and we certainly will be too. All right, let's move on from our little promotional stuff there, and let's get into our interesting and fascinating conversation with Matt Erhlich as we talk about this friction, this rivalry between Kansas City and Oakland on the football gridiron, on the baseball diamond. It's a fascinating chat, and I please implore you to enjoy. I hope you like it. Let's dive right into it, because the juxtaposition, I guess, between the metropolitan areas of Kansas City and Oakland to the cursory eye isn't necessarily one where I don't know. I don't know if there's an obvious sort of linkage, right? But perhaps the sports rivalries, maybe unintended, frankly, as things have played out, right? I don't think anybody in the old AFL, right, would have guessed how much of a rivalry the Chiefs and the Raiders would have, not only in the AFL, but spilling over to many, many years, even arguably still today in the NFL, right? And then you throw that into the, frankly, bizarre relationship between Kansas City and Oakland in baseball, right? Which was as a direct lineage and or a taking of, if you will, or a bold move of a team that. What are the seeds of this theme, right? Is it the AFL? Is that kind of the beginnings of it, or?
Yeah, I would say that it's actually a little bit before the AFL days, because the thing I think that links the two cities, which are very, very different in many ways, and of course they're geographically far separated. The thing that I think links them is this idea of a civic inferiority complex, and the AFL being formed in part for cities that really had been overlooked as major league cities. A lot of those cities literally had no big league sports. And so even before the AFL was formed in 1959 and started play in 1960, both Kansas City and Oakland wanted to become big league. They wanted to be seen in the eyes of the nation as being major league cities. And these were, like most cities west of the Mississippi River, cities that had long, proud histories in minor league sports, especially minor league baseball, but had never had that major league presence that so many of the older cities east of the Mississippi had. And so both of them looked to Major League Baseball first in the 1950s, when finally baseball started to expand out of the original 16 teams. And so that's how Kansas City ended up getting the Philadelphia Athletics. The Philadelphia Athletics, once upon a time, were a wonderful baseball team. in the last years of Connie Mack's ownership and the last years of Connie Mack's life, they had fallen on hard times, and his sons, Connie Mack's sons, were terrible owners and loathed each other, which didn't help anything. And so they were vulnerable to poaching, and Kansas City was able to step in and poach the A's from Philadelphia. And so Oakland saw that. They saw how Baltimore had gotten the St. Louis Browns. They saw how Milwaukee had gotten the Boston Braves. And they were thinking, well, we should be a major league city ourselves in one sport or another, preferably baseball. In the late 1950s, of course, the Dodgers and the Giants both moved from New York to the West Coast, to San Francisco and to Los Angeles. And so Oakland also was seeking to be big league. And before getting into the AFL, it's worth noting that both cities had this civic inferiority complex, not only from not having major league sports, but just they were very self-conscious about their image generally. With Oakland, that's a blue-collar city, an industrial city that has always been in the shadow of San Francisco, this very glamorous cosmopolitan hub of the nation. And so they were very resentful toward San Francisco and wanted to raise their standing, Oaklanders, in relation to San Francisco. Kansas City is smack dab in the middle of the country, a longtime agricultural hub. And its concern was it was seen as just a cow town. There's that very famous song, or infamous song, from the musical Oklahoma. Everything's up to date in Kansas City. They went and built a skyscraper 7 stories high, about as far as they can go. And so Kansas Cityans also had a chip on their shoulder. So that was the backdrop. And then it coincided with the move of baseball franchises to other parts of the country in the 1950s. And so when the AFL came along, again, the AFL was sort of an accidental league. Lamar Hunt founded the American Football League because he wanted an NFL team of his own in Dallas. And the NFL said, we're not going to expand, or we're not going to give you a team. So Lamar Hunt, being rich and ambitious, decided, well, I'll just form a league of my own with my own team, the Dallas Texans. And that immediately prompted the NFL to decide, well, we will have a team in Dallas of our own, the Dallas Cowboys, that was put into competition with the Dallas Texans and eventually forced the Dallas Texans to find a new home. So Kansas City Chiefs were an accidental franchise that it wasn't intended to be until Lamar Hunt was forced by the NFL and its move into Dallas to find a new home. The Oakland Raiders weren't supposed to ever exist either. That was supposed to be an AFL franchise in Minnesota. But just as the NFL expanded into Dallas, when they heard that the AFL was planning to have a team in the state of Minnesota, they decided they would have a franchise in Minnesota, the Vikings. And so the AFL had to find a new home, and the Oakland Raiders came into being. And so this civic inferiority complex, this chip on the shoulder, the fact that it was an accidental league, the AFL, not taken seriously by the NFL, the fact that these two teams in their early years did not have much success, especially the Oakland Raiders before Al Davis took them over in 1963, were just a train wreck of a franchise. And so the fact that this eventually developed into a very heated rivalry between two wonderful professional franchises, two teams that have multiple Hall of Famers and that are remembered with great respect and even awe by a lot of professional football historians, is really extraordinary. It just never should have happened that way, but it did.
Well, so it's interesting because you say sort of chip on their shoulder, right? I mean, Oakland obviously in the shadow of San Francisco, obviously now is the San Francisco Bay Area, which is more of a megalopolis than even it was back in the early 1960s. But still, it's across the bay. It's blue collar versus, more of the sort of white collar and maybe more elitist sort of rootings of the San Francisco and the 49ers at that for that matter. And then Kansas City, right? Albeit, across state kind of shadow, if you will, from its bigger sister, St. Louis, right? Which, of course, St. Louis has been, a part of the baseball landscape almost since the earliest of days of the sport in this country professionally, right? So it is an interesting sort of unloved or under-recognized, I guess, metropolitan or potentially on the come kind of metropolitan area kind of wanting, I guess, to sort of achieve professional status. It's just very interesting how both Kansas City received the A's, like why Kansas City, right? So clearly in the mid to late 50s, right, there was sort of this arguably overdue, I guess, wanderlust of Major League Baseball and this recognition that there were other growing metropolitan areas outside of the Northeast and the Midwest, right? And in the AFL, obviously, Lamar Hunt, as we've talked about in numerous episodes, right? The opportunities extant there for professional football, which is arguably even less worldly, I guess, or expansionary in its mindset. You look at how Oakland, right, got that AFL franchise. I mean, I think by all accounts, it was really, I guess, because of Barron Hilton's Chargers franchise. I guess he wanted another franchise on the West Coast. There was a real scramble to find a place on the West Coast to put a franchise. I mean, I don't think Oakland was even looking for sort of pro football in 1960, were they?
No, not so much that I can tell. And again, if you think 1960, the AFL, who knows what, nobody really has an idea of what the AFL is or was. And so getting an AFL charter franchise is kind of like, you can look back at it and think, well, is that really a big deal? So, yeah, they wanted Barron Hilton of the Chargers, which were originally in Los Angeles. Of course, they now are back in Los Angeles. For many, many years, they were in San Francisco. He wanted a second team in California. He wanted that natural rivalry, and it would make travel arrangements easier. And so the thought was, well, in the NFL, the Los Angeles Rams and the San Francisco 49ers have a good rivalry. We'll just replicate it in the AFL between the Chargers and this new team in the Bay Area of Oakland. Problem is there was no stadium in Oakland. The Coliseum wasn't even in the planning stages yet, except the very, very earliest planning stages. So for the first several years, or at least the first 2 or 3 seasons, the Raiders had to play in the city of San Francisco. So, the fact that they were trying to get out from under the shadow of San Francisco, and then they end up having to share facilities with the 49ers, that itself was a tough pill to swallow. Nobody in San Francisco wanted to see the AFL to begin with, let alone a team representing Oakland. So nobody went to the games. The team was, as we mentioned, just absolutely terrible. They went 2-12, and then the next year they went 1-13. One of my favorite stories about that, which is related in the book, is during their first season of existence, the Raiders were in the city of Boston to play the Boston Patriots, and they couldn't find anywhere to practice except a Little League baseball field. And then they had to leave the field before their practice was over because the Little League teams showed up, and the Little League teams in Boston took precedence over the AFL Raiders. So that's just about, that's as good an example as any of just how sad sack the team was. And there's also the story, of course, of the Oakland Raiders' original name. They were supposed to be called the Oakland Seniors, not even Senores, just Seniors, until people realized what a ridiculous name it was. And fortunately for them, they picked Raiders instead.
I'm really sort of curious as to sort of how these two AFL teams, Kansas City obviously didn't come into play, as you mentioned earlier, because Dallas wasn't sort of working out. I don't think Kansas City was an obvious choice, even in Lamar Hunt's mind. I mean, how does Kansas City... Well, look, I think we remember one of our earlier conversations about Lamar's life and times. I think, if I'm not mistaken, he actually wanted to bring the name Texans to Kansas City as well. They were going to call the Kansas City Texans, and I guess he was mercifully talked out of keeping the nickname when he brought him to Kansas City. But explain to me Kansas City getting this AFL franchise, even though the AFL was still relatively new. It was about 2 years in. This was, I guess, perceived as a nice addition to what was nicely percolating as a few years into their ownership of a baseball franchise too, and arguably maybe cementing itself a bit into the world of big league sports.
Yeah, so Lamar Hunt, it's worthwhile remembering Lamar Hunt was a Dallas guy. He was raised there. He went to college there. He would live his entire life there. Basically, for the entire time that he owned the Kansas City Chiefs, he was an absentee owner, which has a very pejorative label, but essentially that's what he was. He was all about Dallas. And again, the whole reason he founded the AFL was to have his own team in the city of Dallas. So it had to be very difficult for him to decide that to be able to compete and to keep his team afloat because, as of 1962, which is the last year that the Texans were in the city of Dallas, that was also the year that the New York Titans nearly went under, the AFL franchise that eventually became the Jets. So the prospects for the AFL were really murky the first 2 or 3 years. The Raiders in Oakland were doing very poorly, and there were rumors about how they might move, even to the city of Kansas City before the Texans moved there. So Lamar Hunt really had to swallow his pride, and to keep that league afloat, he needed to find a new home. But Kansas City was not his first choice. He wanted to move the team to New Orleans. And the only reason he didn't was because there was no stadium there. He wanted to go into Tulane Stadium, but apparently the city or the Tulane University wouldn't allow that. So he just kind of cast his lot elsewhere. And the mayor of Kansas City at that time, a man named H. Bartle, helped talk Lamar Hunt into moving the team to Kansas City in exchange in part for an extremely generous stadium lease, only $1 a year for, I think it was 2 years, basically giving him the use of Kansas City's old municipal stadium where the Kansas City A's played for free. So that's how the Chiefs came into being and how they ended up going to Kansas City. That's also how they got the name Chiefs, because H. Bartle's nickname was the Chief. And so Lamar Hunt, partly in tribute to Bartle, named the team the Chiefs after, as you mentioned, getting talked out of calling them the Kansas City Texans. He really did have his heart set on that originally, but it just would have been too bizarre. It's also worth noting that in 1963, by then, Charlie Finley had already taken over the Kansas City A's. The A's came to Kansas City, if the American League had been on the ball, they would have moved the Orioles to the West Coast instead of to Baltimore. They would have moved the St. Louis Browns, rather, to the West Coast instead of to Baltimore to become the Orioles. And they would have also moved the A's to the West Coast and basically staked claim there before the National League ever got around to it. They had that opportunity, but instead they ended up going to smaller cities in the East with Baltimore and in the Midwest with Kansas City. And this was despite considerable skepticism by a lot of people in the American League. They were really wondering if Kansas City was big enough to support baseball. There was even a line of somebody in the American League, one of the owners, saying, well, Kansas City has to be exaggerating their population claims. They must be counting corn stalks and heifers in their population claim. That's the only way you can justify having enough people to support the team. And we're able also to draw upon the support of the New York Yankees, who basically had a stranglehold, and their co-owner Del Webb, over the American League at that time. So that's how the A's ended up there. And by 1963, when the Chiefs arrived, the A's had just had year after year of futility. Their original owner in Kansas City, Arnold Johnson, had sold off most of their best players to the New York Yankees, which really annoyed Kansas Cityans who already felt again, kind of in the shadow of New York City and resented New York City and the Yankees, especially having been a longtime New York Yankees farm club. Roger Maris had been had been traded rather, from the A's to the New York Yankees right before he became back-to-back MVP for the Yankees and broke Babe Ruth's home run record. And then Charlie Finley immediately wanted to start trying to move the team as soon as he bought it in 1961. So when the city of Kansas City went after the Chiefs, they were really leery about maybe losing the A's and maybe losing big league status altogether. So they were willing to cast their lot with Lamar Hunt and with the AFL and that franchise, even though the AFL still was on shaky ground. And they were willing to go to great lengths to get that team, even to the point of basically saying, here's the stadium for free, and good luck with it.
Well, that's okay. A lot to unpack there, and that's very interesting. So on the A's front, right? So I got the sense that Johnson was even thinking, perhaps, based on some of the things that I've read, that his ultimate goal was almost like to sort of do a stopover in Kansas City and ultimately move to the West Coast, Los Angeles in particular, maybe even before the Dodgers even got there later in the decade. Too much truth to that. There was a rumor of that was legit in terms of his true motivation. And the Yankees' collusion, that's even more interesting.
Yeah, that's what Bill Veeck was owner of the White Sox in those days. He always believed that was the mission all along, that Arnold Johnson was openly, or not openly, certainly covertly colluding with the New York Yankees and their ownership. The Arnold Johnson got drawn into the ownership of the A's in part because Arnold Johnson also owned Yankee Stadium back in the early 1950s and leased it back to the owners of the Yankees. So there were already business ties between the Yankees ownership and the Kansas City A's ownership under Arnold Johnson. And that was Bill Veeck's theory, and other people have seen a lot of evidence to support it, certainly circumstantial evidence, if nothing else, that the whole idea was that they would be the A's in Kansas City just a short time, and then they eventually would be moved to either San Francisco or Los Angeles, and the real control of the team would rest with the Yankees, would rest with the city of New York and with Del Webb especially. And if that, in fact, was the case, then, of course, total collusion, conflict of interest, and so forth. But even without that, the fact that you have a team, and it's important to remember that when the A's first arrived in Kansas City, they were very enthusiastically received by the people of Kansas City. Ownership, or rather attendance, in their first season, 1955, was second in the American League only to the Yankees, even though the A's were not that good a team. And to see that civic support rewarded by seeing an owner continually plucking away the very best players on your team, shipping them to the New York Yankees, getting a lot of washed up players in return, and seeing this repeated season after season after season was in itself very demoralizing to the city of Kansas City and to the baseball fans of Kansas City. So it was after several years of that, and then Arnold Johnson finally dropping dead during spring training in 1960, and then being replaced after a season where Kansas Cityans scrambled to try to find local ownership and were unable to do so. For Charlie Finley to be the owner who then took over that team and immediately started trying to move it out of Kansas City himself. Well, you can imagine how that made Kansas Cityans felt already with that proverbial chip on their shoulders. And again, looking for any straw they could grasp to try to keep some semblance of big league status whether by trying to placate Finley with baseball or by trying to get an AFL team with the knowledge that the National Football League would never look twice at a city like Kansas City.
Well, some real irony there, right? So Finley coming in and sort of acting as, I guess, sort of, and duplicity too, let's be honest, right? About him basically winding up with the franchise after Johnson's demise and buying it, I guess, from the estate. But I guess Finley was the guy that Johnson had beaten out originally when the A's were rattling around to leave Philadelphia in the first place.
Yeah, Finley had been looking to move into baseball for a long time. And so he did have a deal in mind to propose to the A's ownership in Philadelphia. There were also, of course, people in Philadelphia who really wanted to keep the team in that city and failed to do so. And it seems that one of the main factors that worked in Arnold Johnson's favor was, again, he had the business ties with the Yankees ownership. And it was really the Yankees who were crucial in saying, we're not going to sell to new owners in Philadelphia, and we're not going to sell the team to Charlie Finley or to anybody else. We're going to sell it to Arnold Johnson and move it to Kansas City. But Finley is a fascinating person.
He's seen as a savior initially, no?
Yeah, Sports Illustrated did this great big profile of him in June 1961, right after he had bought the team. They called him the kindliest owner in baseball, which has to be the most ironic comment ever in a sports magazine, considering the reputation that Finley would have in a very short time frame. Mayor Bartle, who we already mentioned in Kansas City, was very concerned with Kansas City having big league status. He said, Charlie Finley has the heart of the city in his palm. It was really felt that Finley would be the guy who would keep the team in the city. And even as he was saying, by golly, I'm never going to leave the city of Kansas City, even though he was burning a bus, literally burning a bus that he said represented the shuttle between Kansas City and New York, the shuttle that had taken away Roger Maris and all the other A's players that eventually ended up in Yankees uniforms. Burning he said the escape clause that he said would allow him to get out of his lease. It turned out that was all a sham, and almost immediately he began trying to move the team. His first target was Dallas, ironically enough, that eventually Kansas City would be able to get the Dallas Texans from. But for years, he was an insurance salesman. He had no ties to baseball. I think he played it a little bit when he was very, very young, but he just decided it would be fun to run a baseball team. The irony is that he turned out to be really, really, really good at it. He was kind of a baseball savant, but that did not become apparent until several years later. And along with being such a baseball genius, he was also a very petty, very vain, very narcissistic guy, very vindictive. And the wonderful players that he signed by opening up his wallet never came to their full potential in the city of Kansas City. It would only be several years later, after Oakland poached the team from Kansas City and moved the A's from Kansas City to Oakland in 1967. And that coincidentally happened at about the same time that the Raiders and the Chiefs finally got past their early troubles and got good. So it was in the late 60s that all of this came to a head. The rivalry between the Raiders and the Chiefs, and then the rivalry between the A's, who immediately got good, immediately began to win after leaving Kansas City for Oakland, and the rivalry between that team and the expansion team that Kansas City got in compensation for losing the A's, and that would be the Royals.
Before we sort of jump back into the football side of it, because that's obviously a subtext to sort of what we're discussing sort of in the foreground with baseball, why was Finley so irascible, I guess, and just so fitful trying to move the team from Kansas City? Because it seems like there was a period of time there, those couple of years, right, where Louisville was voted on and it was voted down, and then there was a move towards Oakland. It looks like there's a whole bunch of other cities that were sort of in the mix, and I think he even threatened moving them out into some exurb of Kansas City out in Missouri somewhere with like temporary bleachers and stuff. What was his problem with Kansas City? I mean, arguably, the early years prior to his ownership, right, there was an outpouring of interest in this team. It almost seems like all he had to do was kind of put some effort into the team and the metropolitan area. He might have actually had something going.
Well, to quote Joe McGuff, who was a longtime sports writer for the Kansas City Star, he looked back on Finley years and years later, and McGuff said, I think there was just something wrong with Charlie. That's as good an explanation as I can come up with. I mean, that whole scenario repeated itself in Oakland. He was a kind of person who, when he moved to a new city, and this is the way he seemed to be when he first moved, got hold of the A's and was in Kansas City, was like a kid with a new toy. And it was just wonderful. Everything was wonderful. And then he got bored. And immediately it was like, well, there aren't enough fans here. I'm not getting a good enough deal here. Actually, one of the things that really got his goat early on was this really sweetheart kind of deal that the city of Kansas City offered Lamar Hunt and the Kansas City Chiefs, charging only $1 a year for stadium rent. And so Finley said, well, by golly, I've been here longer than the Chiefs have, and I put a lot of my own money into trying to improve this old stadium. Well, I should get $1 a year rent too. And in fact, the city council of Kansas City approved that before a new mayor and a new city council took office, and then immediately negated the deal, saying it was illegal. And so he just got very angry, very vindictive. And he tried to move to the city of Louisville. He said, well, we can move to Louisville. We'll become the Kentucky Colonels. That way we can keep the KC in our caps. He said, well, I'm not going to play in Municipal Stadium in Kansas City. I'm not going to give them the satisfaction of playing in a stadium that's, charging me an unfair rent. So I'm going to move the team to a cow pasture. And he took reporters and photographers with him to this cow pasture. One was near a town in Missouri called Peculiar. So the joke then became, well, they're going to be the Peculiar A's. And so Finley was just like that. He could be incredibly charming. He was very, very bright. He was incredibly hardworking. He had great promotional sense. Sometimes it was a really cheesy kind of promotional sense, but, he was one of the people who pushed for night baseball in the World Series, who pushed for the designated hitter, and whose innovations in that regard, for better or worse, finally did come to pass. But the same thing happened when he moved the team to Oakland. At first, he was really, really happy with Oakland. He was talking about how he was going to draw 1.5 million spectators per year. And when that did not happen, then immediately the rumors began about how he was going to pull the team out of the city of Oakland and go to Washington or go to Dallas or go to who knows where. So it just seemed to be the way that Charlie Finley was wired.
All right, a brief pause in the proceedings just for a second to pay a couple of bills, and we appreciate your giving our sponsors some consideration as always. And one of our earliest ones that continues to be with us and we love is our friends at Audible. And Audible is, as you know, the king of audiobooks. And if you've never tried an audiobook for yourself, well, here's a great opportunity to do so and to support the show at the same time. And that's when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's the place to go, and you're going to get a free audiobook download for yourself to try for free, gratis, on us. You can cancel the Audible service at any time. And once you do download that book, and if you do decide to cancel it, it's yours to keep.
So that's our little free gift. And even if you don't continue with the Audible service going forward, you at least get a free audiobook out of the deal. And look, if you consider yourself somebody who's interested in sports and sports history and that kind of stuff, like we try to pursue on this little podcast, you're going to find a whole bunch of titles in the vast array of, 190,000 and counting titles to choose from. And in particular, if you like the hoops, the basketball, well, sure, we got a couple of those books, including, of course, probably the quintessential tome, oral history, if you will, of the ABA, the American Basketball Association. That's called Loose Balls. And Terry Pluto is the writer and I believe the narrator of that book as well. That you could use your credit for that. And it's a wonderful romp, that book, and a great oral history of perhaps the most colorful basketball league of all time, the ABA. Or if you're really interested, let's say, in the National Basketball Association's history, you could check out the audiobook from our previous guest, David Surdam, who we had a great chat about the history of the NFL. But this book is called The Rise of the National Basketball Association. And David wrote it. It's narrated by Todd Bars-Ness. You say that 3 times fast. And a lot of the interesting stuff in this book talks about the NBA in the context of congressional hearings around antitrust and that kind of stuff around the 40s and 1950s. Fascinating stuff. And you could use your credit for that book too, among, like I said, 190,000+ other titles to choose from at Audible. And again, it's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And you're going to get, again, your free audiobook download courtesy of us. You can cancel at any time. It is yours to keep. And we appreciate you giving them a try. And we certainly appreciate you rejoining our conversation right now. So the Raiders finally, well, I guess they spent the first couple of years somewhat in a vagabond state, right? Trying to find decent places to play on a standardized and regular basis in the region, including a few games, it looks like, in San Francisco and places other than Oakland proper. But it's also pretty clear that this AFL thing was really taking off during the middle part of the 60s. And the two teams that wound up being arguably the most successful were both the Kansas City Chiefs and the Oakland Raiders. So I guess a question around maybe Oakland's early and middle years as a team, because I think it's also the linchpin of this is ultimately what's going to now become the Oakland Alameda Coliseum, right? Because without that, I don't think Finley even has a real move to go to Oakland, does he?
Yeah, that was, and again, this was something that the people in Oakland, Oakland for many years had a very stolid, conservative leadership, business leadership and political leadership, especially with William Noland, who's the former senator, U.S. senator from California, and a longtime publisher, editor of the Oakland Tribune. And with the Oakland Tribune really leading the way, the city fathers, city parents, if you will, of Oakland, decided that professional sports was going to be a path to civic greatness. And a key element of that would be the construction of the Oakland Coliseum. And so the planning for that started in the early 1960s. The ground broke in 1964, and it finally opened in 1966. And the years in which the Coliseum was being planned and built were also the years that the Raiders transformed themselves from a joke into a viable franchise. And the key factor there was very simply Al Davis. Davis coming from the Chargers and assuming the management of the team. He was also the first coach of the team. And he was the one who gave the Raiders the silver and black uniforms and the Pirates insignia on the helmets. In 62 and 1963, the team finally started playing in the city of Oakland on a temporary field, Frank Ewell Field, basically a high school stadium, but it created a good atmosphere within the city of Oakland for the Raiders. Davis was a very good promoter. He did a very savvy job of kind of playing into that chip on the shoulder feeling that the people in Oakland had and the Raiders fans had. And in Kansas City, the Chiefs got good in part because Lamar Hunt was rich. And this was the time frame in which the AFL and the NFL were in open warfare. It was before the merger was announced in 1966. And Lamar Hunt had a very deep pocketbook, so he was able to shell out big bucks for people like Mike Garrett, who was the Heisman Trophy winner. Everyone expected him to go with the Los Angeles Rams. People like Otis Taylor, several other blue chip college athletes. So by 1966, when the Coliseum opens, that's the time that Kansas City finally wins its first division title and goes to the first Super Bowl. And the following year, 1967, Oakland would win the AFL title and go to the second Super Bowl. So those two teams, by the end of the 60s and the final years of the AFL, really were the class of the league, along with Joe Namath and the New York Jets. And it was the Coliseum as well that gave Charlie Finley a potential home to move to. If that stadium had not been there, he likely would not have been as interested, if he would have been as interested at all in the city of Oakland. And it was also a key factor in persuading the American League to actually approve the move of the A's to Oakland.
I got the sense that he wanted to move him to Oakland even before that stadium was done, right? And if that's the case, where would they have played temporarily? Certainly not Frank Ewell Field, which is arguably just a rectangle with some, very broadly spread seats.
Yeah, basically a high school field with, it looked exactly like a high school field with little sets of bleachers on either sideline. Yeah, in 1964, at the same time that Finley was talking about playing in a cow pasture and talking about playing in Louisville, Kentucky, he also, for a time, was trying to move the team to Oakland even before the Coliseum was built. Groundbreaking had occurred, so there was the certitude that eventually that stadium would exist within a couple of seasons. But the idea was that for the first two seasons, either they would have played in Candlestick Park across the bay in San Francisco, which Horace Stoneham, the owner of the Giants, quickly nixed. He said, "There's no way we're going to let an American League team play in San Francisco." He wanted the Bay Area to himself, with good reason. And you mentioned Frank Ewell Field. The city of Oakland was so eager to try to land in a Major League Baseball team by that point that they actually offered to rebuild Frank Ewell Field for just 2 years, expand it enough that it could pass for a Major League Baseball team.
Interesting.
Yeah, but it ended up being a moot point because the American League said, "You're not going to leave Kansas City. You're going to sign a new lease." And that's what Charlie Finley, over vocal protests on his part, ended up doing, signing a lease that kept him there until 1967. But by that point, he was sufficiently embittered and sufficiently eager to leave Kansas City that there was just no way the city was going to hold him.
All right. Well, so before we get into both teams domiciling in Oakland, because then I think it sort of almost augurs for, sort of a next generation of this story and this dynamic. Explain maybe a bit of sort of how in the AFL, the Kansas City Chiefs and the Raiders became, I guess, almost sort of, unwitting rivals, right? It doesn't seem on paper that these would have been natural rivals when the AFL was being set up, nor even going into the NFL. But it did seem that there was, and maybe you can sort of speak to it, or maybe it was just kind of random luck that the games were really good and competitive, or maybe there was something more to it. But what was it between these two, arguably not obviously rival cities, that maybe kind of became kind of a rivalry and maybe a must-watch in the AFL, it seemed?
Yeah, definitely. Usually when you think of sports rivals, you think of teams that have geographic proximity. So you think of the Chicago Cubs, St. Louis Cardinals. You think of the Chicago Bears, Green Bay Packers. You think of the San Francisco Giants and Los Angeles Dodgers. That, of course, was already a rivalry, a terrific rivalry in the city of New York between the Brooklyn Dodgers and New York Giants, and then got exported to the state of California. But those two teams were still in the same state. And Kansas City and Oakland are thousands of miles apart. One is a Midwest city, the other one is a coastal city. So you wouldn't think that they would have that kind of rivalry. And I think it was, again, simply a product of accident. They were both in the Western division of the AFL. And so the way the AFL schedule worked, that meant that they were going to play each other 2 times every season. And when the 2 teams got good at about the same time, that typically meant that those 2 teams, every time they played, or just about every time, were playing with first place in stake. So the rivalry developed that way. And then you had all these great players. You had Len Dawson, Otis Taylor, Mike Garrett, Willie Lanier, Buck Buchanan, Curly Culp, those guys on the Chiefs. And guys like first Darryl LaMonica as the quarterback for the Raiders, and then later Ken Stabler, guys like Ben Davidson and George Blanda, Art Shell, Gene Upshaw, Fred Biletnikoff, all these names that football aficionados are so familiar with. When all of those guys are on the same field at the same time, and so much is at stake in terms of this place in the standings, that's what really gave birth to the rivalry. And as I mentioned, the civic rivalry, and this is about the time that I first became aware of it, the civic rivalry really helped fuel it after the A's left the city of Kansas City for the city of Oakland. Then the rivalry became more than just about these 2 football teams playing each other at least twice each season. Then it was 2 cities fighting for big league prominence, 2 cities with reason to resent each other, 2 cities with a reason to really dislike each other both on and off the field. And this also was the time that the AFL's stature rose in the eyes of the country after they signed a really lucrative football deal with a television deal, rather, with NBC. Starting, I think, in 1964, the games got nationally televised. And so, I've seen a quote from one football historian who was saying that it really became must-watch television back in the days when there was still such a thing as must-watch television. It was always the late game on NBC, the game that would air in the late afternoons, that would be beamed to the whole country. So the whole country became aware of the rivalry. And then the teams started fighting each other on the field with full-scale brawls. So it was good television in addition to being just good sports. So all of that built this rivalry, rivalry that you never would have thought would have happened, that never really was planned. You could argue that there should have been a really big rivalry between the Raiders and the Chargers because they were both in California, and you had that Bay Area, Southern California rivalry.
Yeah, that's what Conrad Hilton wanted, right? He thought that would be the natural rival.
And the San Diego Chargers were actually really good early on in the AFL, but that did not correspond with really quality years for the most part for the Raiders or the Chiefs. So by the time the Raiders and the Chiefs were in their ascendancy, the Chargers, although they were still a good team, were not really in the class of those 2 other teams. So that's really how the rivalry existed. And that's one of the things that I just found so interesting about it, is Kansas City and Oakland are not 2 cities you would think have a whole lot in common. But in fact, they did have a lot in common during this time period, and they were bound together through this rivalry that nobody planned.
Yeah, and then maybe sort of accented by the A's absconding to Oakland and domiciling themselves ultimately in the same stadium as those dreaded, hated rival Raiders in the football side of things. Maybe we can sort of also maybe backfill then what happened when the A's left Kansas City, because really quickly, and for some obvious reasons and maybe not so obvious reasons, Kansas City was not bereft of Major League Baseball for too long after the A's departure.
Yeah, so the deal was that the American League owners got together in October 1967. The main thing that they were meeting to discuss was whether the A's would be allowed to move from Kansas City to Oakland. And, the other owners did not like Charlie Finley. They were not naturally predisposed to give him whatever he wanted, and in fact had kept him from moving the team before and basically forced him to sign a new lease with the city of Kansas City. So it was not clear cut that the move would be allowed, but he made a good case, and the city leaders in Oakland, people like William Noland again, the publisher of the Tribune, made a case that, well, we have this brand new stadium there. It's going to be a really good home for Major League Baseball. It will help with scheduling in the American League because the California Angels had already started play in Anaheim. So again, there would be two teams, American League teams in the state of California, which would help travel and help with rivalries and so forth. So the case was made that the team should move, but Kansas Cityans were having nothing of it. And they sent their own delegation to this meeting and said, look, this guy has been trying to sabotage baseball. This guy, Charlie Finley, has been trying to sabotage baseball in Kansas City basically ever since he got hold of the team in 1961. And we've done everything we can to try to try to pacify him. And it just hasn't worked. And now you're letting him take this team away from us with all this young talent about to blossom. I mean, it was pretty obvious even then that the team was about to get really, really good. And so how can you let this happen? And it was really Stuart Symington, who was a United States Senator from Missouri, who issued a not-so-veiled threat. And he said, if you take Major League Baseball away from Kansas City for a prolonged period of time, or take it away from Kansas City forever, I'm just going to have to start a little antitrust investigation in Congress about Major League Baseball. And the big league owners were already very leery about such action because the Milwaukee Braves had just left after only 13 seasons to move to Atlanta. And the big stink was raised about that over in the National League, and there were antitrust suits threatened back then. So they said, okay, we'll give Kansas City a new major league team, an expansion team that will start play in 1969. So Kansas City ended up being without big league baseball for only 1 year, when it looked as though they would be without baseball for at least 3 years if they ever were able to get another team again. And the Royals ended up being sort of a consolation prize, but it turned out to be a nice consolation prize because that team got to be pretty good pretty quickly. And then their chief rivals in the American League West Division, the new American League West Division, turned out to be the Oakland A's, the same team that had left Kansas City only a few years before. So that's how the rivalry bled over into baseball into a new decade.
Well, maybe we can sort of round the corner with that new decade, because obviously the 70s were interesting, I guess, is just a potentially mundane word to kind of describe it, right? But the rivalries between these two cities now with firmly established teams in both football and in baseball, it seems like that they just became deeper and more entrenched and almost sort of go-to in terms of expectation that fireworks were going to fly and competitiveness would sort of be at a heightened level when these two teams were taking the field. And I'm gonna make a sort of a random sort of statement here. It feels to me that maybe on the football gridiron it was a little more heated than on the baseball diamond, or would you argue that they were similar in terms of peak?
Well, certainly the Chiefs-Raiders rivalry the Chiefs-Raiders rivalry exists to this very day, and will likely persist even after the Raiders moved to Las Vegas. I mean, it was a heated rivalry when the Raiders were in Los Angeles before moving back to Oakland. So when people think of a Kansas City-Oakland rivalry, that's what they think of. They don't think of a rivalry really between the Royals and the A's. Having said that, for a brief period, especially I would say between about 1973 and 1976, which coincided with a very colorful time in baseball generally. The Royals and the A's were very, very heated rivals. And I mentioned it coincided with a colorful time in baseball. I just remember it as a time when fights broke out routinely. Beanings, pitchers plunking players on other teams, batters then charging the mound. Sometimes these fights spilling over into the spectators. The Royals and the A's were two teams that did not like each other. And I grew up with this rivalry, as I mentioned. I just remembered it that whenever a Kansas City professional team, whether it was either the Chiefs or the Raiders, whenever they would venture into the Oakland Coliseum, bad things would happen. Really awful things would happen to the Chiefs. They would get crushed. Their players would be the subject of cheap hits and so forth. And then the same thing seemed to happen with baseball, because the mid-1970s were the time that the Kansas City Royals became contenders, a little bit of ahead of schedule. People didn't expect an expansion team to get that good that quickly, but they did. And unfortunately for the Kansas City Royals, that corresponded with the time that the Oakland A's were the best team in baseball and won 3 consecutive World Series. And so it was a time that, just as on the football field, you saw brawls between the two teams, beanball wars, war of words, nasty things being said about each other in the press, with locker room copy, posting things in the locker room to try to get motivated that the other team's players had supposedly said. And it culminated in 1966 in a game in the Coliseum, where the Coliseum fans started throwing beer on the Kansas City Royals bullpen. The Royals bullpen started fighting back. One of the Royals players grabbed a spectator's umbrella, started swinging it at the fans. So for at least a brief period, the baseball rivalry was every bit as heated as the football rivalry.
Well, it's also interesting, too, because as the 70s wore on, I think Finley kind of, obviously there was some championship seasons there in the early part of the decade, but my, oh my, by the end of the decade, it's clear that the Royals were certainly more ascendant, and the A's, maybe self-inflicted from Finley's, shall we call them, curious ways. I think in 79, you're talking about hundreds of people showing up at the A's games in the latter part of the decade.
Yeah, there's a famous story. I think there was a game in April 78 or 79 in the Coliseum, a night game. And of course, night games in the Coliseum can be very cold, especially in April, early in the season. And there was something like a paid attendance of 689, except that the people were there saying that was a gross overstatement, that it wasn't nearly as big an attendance as that. One player started counting literally each person in the stands before he finally gave up. But yeah, it was Finley's peculiarities, but also just his cheapness. He decided he couldn't compete anymore because by the late 1970s, that was the age of free agency. And so he just decided, well, I'm going to get out and get out of the game. And in the meantime, I'm going to run this operation on the cheapest shoestring that I can possibly do it. But even then, Finley still was able to get some really good players. The most famous would have been Rickey Henderson, who made his debut right at the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 1980s. And after Finley sold the team by the early 80s, and especially toward the end of that decade, the A's were powers again. But certainly by the end of the decade, the Royals were the main team in the American League West. The A's had pretty much collapsed their dynasty. And the real rivalry that the Royals experienced became with the New York Yankees by the late 70s.
Well, so describe to me then, and obviously there's a lot more rich detail in this book, and it's really very well researched. I give you kudos for that, especially because it does unearth a few sort of lesser known or maybe not even known real facts. When you look at it and you juxtapose these two cities and the way they grew up, if you will, and became sort of part of modern metropolitan areas, and how sports was either directly or indirectly sort of part of that sort of that maturation. I guess you're probably the best person to ask this sort of maybe wrap-up question, is sort of where do we see Oakland and Kansas City with its relationships, plural, to sports and themselves as metropolitan areas going forward? I mean, you look at things like the explosion of growth in the Bay Area and how Oakland is becoming, I don't want to say gentrified, but maybe that's the proper word for it. Kansas City certainly, has with the Wizards, for example, and the district downtown and the Sprint Center, albeit now still without an NHL or an NBA franchise. But it's a major metropolitan area now, almost to the point of rivaling that of St. Louis in terms of population and influence. What of these two metropolitan areas, and how much would you say that sports is still part of their lives going forward? It seems to me like they're still pretty inextricably entwined.
Yeah, Oakland is an interesting case study right now because they are about to lose the Raiders, probably after this season. If not, then after next season. It really seems to depend on whether the new stadium in Las Vegas will be ready by 2020 season.
And the Warriors, too, now go across the bay to their brand new center, right? And there's talk about the A's probably staying, though, and that might be interesting if the right stadium environment can be done economically.
And that's the real key question. The city of Oakland seems to have decided that it simply is not worth trying to shell out enormous sums of public dollars to try to keep a team like the Raiders especially, or to try to compete with the Chase Center in San Francisco. So it really comes down to, do they really want to do whatever it takes to keep the A's in the city of Oakland? And so the real question will be, will there be a new ballpark for the A's? And if so, where will it be located and how will it be paid for? And to an outsider, and I'm definitely an outsider when it comes to the city of Oakland, it sounds to me as though the A's are saying the right sorts of things. They are saying that, we will pay for the stadium ourselves with certain conditions, but they're not expecting the city of Oakland or the Bay Area to shell out all the funding for it. But it's very controversial because of gentrification, because of an affordable housing crisis in the Bay Area and in the city of Oakland, and because of the same sorts of racial divisions and class divisions that have long been characteristic of the Bay Area. Question will really come to the fore in the very near future, if they haven't come to the fore already. What will the city of Oakland really be willing to do to try to keep the A's? Or will they eventually decide, we don't feel as though, given all the other priorities that we have to deal with, that having that Major League Baseball identity or that Major League identity generally is all that important anymore. So that makes Oakland a real interesting case study going forward. And for the city of Kansas City, in the immediate future, it seems as though the city doesn't really have anything to worry about, that the Royals and the Chiefs are there as with leases signed at the Truman Sports Complex, at least until the year 2031. But then you realize that the year 2031 is really not that far away if you are thinking at all about a new sports facility. By the year 2031, the Truman Sports Complex will be almost 60 years old. And new ownership is about to take over the Kansas City Royals. And there's a lot of talk about maybe there should be a downtown ballpark in Kansas City. There hasn't been a downtown ballpark in Kansas City basically ever. Municipal Stadium was located a fair distance away from the city center. So the city of Kansas City is going to have to deal with the same sorts of questions that Oakland has been dealing with. Should there be a new stadium? If so, where should it be? Who's going to pay for it? With everything else that urban areas have to deal with, is it really that important to keep the Chiefs and the Raiders? And so that's really the key question that this whole sports rivalry and the whole history behind it raises. I will go on record that I think professional sports can do a fair amount to bring together a city's people. I think it does engender civic pride. It's important not to place too much weight on it to the expense of everything else, especially when it comes to public spending on sports facilities and sports teams, because sports teams have resorted to virtual extortion when it comes to playing cities against one another to try to hold and attract teams. But still, I would like it if the A's remained in the city of Oakland. The A's have a great history in the city of Oakland. And certainly both the Chiefs and the Royals have established great histories to the city of Kansas City. So it would be nice to see a fruitful compromise reached. But we live in really interesting times, and the years ahead promise to be even more interesting.
Well, I think that's right. And I know we sort of really didn't talk about soccer in this conversation, but you look at Major League Soccer almost sort of as even a shorter sort of microcosm of Jekyll and Hyde, co-locating with NFL arenas and building soccer-specific stadiums first in sort of suburban areas, like in Kansas City's case, out almost near Kansas City, Kansas, and the border there. But then actually now a renaissance just within a few years of seeing how downtown might be a more authentic quote-unquote soccer experience, especially if a brand new stadium is built. And St. Louis evidence of that, but Kansas City having created, frankly, a transformation of their original Major League Soccer franchise with a very successful one, albeit not this year, in terms of on-the-field performance, with Sporting Kansas City and that beautiful park, a state-of-the-art park near Kansas City, Kansas. It's just very interesting how real estate has become almost sort of issue one, perhaps more so than in any other era of professional sports in this country. And I guess to your point, how cities, quote unquote, metropolitan areas, civic pride, almost seems to kind of bow or cower to the sort of real estate issues related, even before the team and its play and maybe what it means for civic pride in terms of playing and the actual sport itself, which is really weird, really interesting if you're a longtime sports fan, but perhaps a sign of the times economically. And this is not a new concept. We've seen this in the earliest days of baseball back in the 1800s, right? It's a business. But it seems like the business is in all capital letters now. It's a very interesting dynamic that we're kind of boomeranging into. And, the money's getting bigger and the stakes are getting higher, and how taxpayers and municipalities deal with that, and some having the gumption to kind of say no, some recognizing that they desperately or think they desperately need it to keep their status amongst other cities and metropolitan areas. It's a really interesting time, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I think cities have started to wise up. I think the city of Oakland has wised up when it came to the Raiders. It's ironic that the city of Oakland rebuilt the Coliseum to get the Raiders back from the city of Los Angeles after the Raiders had left once before. And they built that enormous center field deck called sardonically Mount Davis, after Al Davis, the owner of the Raiders at that time. The Davis family still owns the team. And so they built that center field deck for expanded football seating, and apparently that deck isn't even being used for football seating anymore. So the city of Oakland, I think, has learned a hard and bitter lesson when it comes to football, at least. Other cities are also looking more critically, it seems, at just the price that really is worth paying to try to keep or attract a major league team. And they are balancing it against other kinds of priorities, one of which is trying to make the central business districts or the urban hub a really vital, interesting place. And, if a new stadium, whether it's for football or soccer or baseball or whatever, is a means toward really rejuvenating a downtown area, and it can be done in a relatively cost-efficient sort of way, then it can be a good thing. But, and then there are cities like Las Vegas, and I don't want to harp too much on Las Vegas because I haven't researched it enough. But, it does make you wonder when a city decides it's going to shell out $750 million in public money to try to land a football team, with all the urban needs that the Las Vegas area has, and whether that's really going to pay off for that community. Maybe it will, but it does show that there are still cities, in the waning months of the second decade of the 21st century that are still really eager to be big league and are still eager, just as Kansas City and Oakland were back in the 1950s and 1960s, to really pay a price. They think it's a worthwhile price to be able to say, we have big league hockey, we have big league football, maybe we'll have big league baseball or other sports, and this will really put us on the map as a metropolitan area to be reckoned with. So in some respects, cities are repeating history, and in other respects, they're making new history by breaking away from this pattern of basically paying whatever price they think needs to be paid for being big league.
All right, you consider yourself a fan of the Oakland Raiders or the Kansas City Chiefs, well, as they battle it out for supremacy in the AFC West this season. Maybe you're a fan of the soon-to-be Las Vegas Raiders. You got your season tickets and your personal seat license for the new stadium there. Well, hell, maybe even you're just not even a football fan, but perhaps a baseball fan, and you enjoy the A's in Oakland and hope they stay there. And maybe even as Kansas City Royals fan. If you're a fan of any of those franchises, you have absolute entree into this story. That is the bitter sports rivalry. That is that of Kansas City and Oakland. And again, the book, the definitive book on that theory and that topic, written by our guest, Matt Erhlich. It's called Kansas City versus Oakland, the bitter sports rivalry that defined an era. It is published by the University of Illinois Press. It is available wherever you find good books. And one of those places, of course, is on our website and through our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode. It's, I think, number 136. My goodness, with our pal Matt Erhlich. And you will find a convenient link to that book. And of course, all of the other great books and items that we've got through the years now on our website, whether it be books or movies or other forms of media. And by doing so, not only will you help Matt out by buying a copy or two of that book, but we would appreciate if you did it that way too, because you'll give us a few shekels in the process. And of course, we appreciate that. And while you're there at goodseatsstillavailable.com, why don't you stick around and find some other cool stuff to do, like looking at and finding and subscribing and following us on all of our social media feeds. Say on Twitter, we're at Good Seats Still. And on Instagram, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. You'll find us on Facebook. Sure you will. There's a page devoted to us there. Let's see. You can also send us email from the site or just directly if you want. Go ahead. Do it. I don't care. Hello at goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's how you get to me via email. If you also want to sign up for our weekly email newsletter, well, you can do that too. There's a convenient link there. If you just search around, you'll find it. And that'll give you a little bit of an inside scoop a couple of days earlier than the hoi polloi. And find out what's coming up for next week and all the other doings on this here little show. Let's see. We thank not only Matt and you for listening, but also our pal Jerry. Jerry Payne, his name is, and of course, he's the chief cook and bottle washer amongst the merry band of no goods there at Podfly Productions. No, they're actually really good. And in particular, Jerry is really good at the production thing. And he helps and has been helping us for the last couple of years, getting all of our stuff together to make some semblance of a show each and every week. And we appreciate it. And you will too. If you want to get into podcasting and learn about how the whole process works and stuff, you can find out more about Podfly at podfly.com. All right, that is it for this week. I thank you tremendously for listening this far, and hope you enjoyed it. And we look forward to presenting you with another fun-filled episode next week. And until then, our thanks, and we'll see you next week. Take care.